Hi, and welcome to today's event, Through the Lens of Hidden Treasures at the House of European History. My name is Jennifer Wong, and I am part of the learning team here at the museum. I'm honored to welcome Ms. Vita Tērauda to today's event. Thank you, Vita, for being here with us. I want to thank all of you as well, whether you're joining us in the audience at the museum or on our live stream online. We're so happy you could make it today. This is the fifth installment of our museum's hybrid series, Through the Lens of, which aims to help us better understand history by focusing on personal stories that are linked to our collection at the museum. Ms. Vita Tērauda is here today to share her family's story and to help us discover a hidden treasure here in our own museum, a very special teddy bear named Tedis. After the talk, we will have a 30-minute Q&A here on site and for our online audience as well, where you can all ask Vita your questions that you have from the event. Thank you, Vita, for coming all the way from Latvia to be with us today. Please help me welcome Ms. Vita Tērauda.
It's my pleasure to be here with you today, because who could say no to an opportunity to come visit my friend Tedis? I haven't seen him in a while because he's been living in museums. So I'm here to tell you the story of Tedis today, because Tedis has had way more adventures than I have had, but I will help you understand what he's been doing for many, many decades throughout Europe, the US, back in Europe, and now here at the museum. Tedis was a teddy bear that was gifted to my mother. You can see her here as a little girl. It's in the 1930s in Latvia. My mother lived in a little town in Latvia called Balvi. It's in the eastern part of Latvia, very near to the Russian border. She grew up there with her parents. Her parents were teachers. My grandfather was head of the local school, and my grandmother taught Latvian language at the local school. Now, in the 30s in Europe, it was not an easy time because war was brewing. World War II was coming. World War II came to Latvia pretty quickly. In 1939, the neighboring country of the Soviet Union, Russia, came in and occupied Latvia, similar to what they've been doing in parts of Ukraine today. They were there for a year. It was a very tough time for Latvians. Thousands and thousands of people were taken and deported to Siberia. Many of those people were the artists, the writers, the lawyers, the teachers. But then, as in war, Hitler's army came and pushed out the Russians. So Latvia's like, yay, the Russians are gone, but oops, Hitler, that can't be good. Hitler was there until 1944, and then the Russians pushed him out. So once again, yay, Hitler's gone, but the Russians are back. And with the Russians coming back, my mother's family said, we cannot stay here because we're very afraid that my parents, my grandparents, teachers, would be deported in the next waves of deportations. So they made the decision that they would leave Latvia until the time when the war would be completely over and Russia would be gone, Latvia would be independent again. So they became refugees. And my mom was about 10 years old at the time, in 1944. And what can you imagine? What do you take with you when you're told you are leaving? We don't know whether you're coming back in a month, in a year, in 10 years, or ever. And they packed all sorts of amazing things, and my mom was allowed to take a few things, and she took her friend Tedis. So Tedis launched on this big journey with my mom, first across Latvia, then on a ship. They left Latvia with many, many other refugees on a ship, and they got to Germany. Germany at that time the war had ended, Germany had lost, and Germany itself was a pretty devastated place. If you look at today's pictures of some of the places in the Ukraine, you can imagine everything has been bombed. But there were people coming because people were fleeing from places worse off. Many of those places from those areas where the Russian army had pushed the Germans out, but had remained. And my parents ended up with many others in refugee camps in Germany. These camps were set up by the United Nations, and they housed refugees, gave them a home until people could understand what next. And for many people in those camps, they stayed there for years. And if I would talk to my grandparents and my parents about camp life, you have to understand there's very different pictures that emerge. For my grandparents, it was a very, very tough thing. They were displaced. They were in a strange country. Fortunately for my grandparents, they spoke German, so they were at least a bit able to get oriented, but there was poverty. They lived in barracks in one room with other families divided by sheets and curtains. But if you talk to the kids, to me it sounded like one long summer camp. Because there were so many kids, there were so many parents that had nothing to do. So the parents organized that camp to a little kid. It had school. It had every activity you can imagine. There was folk dancing, there were sports teams, there were competitions. There was theater being put on by the best actors in Latvia because they too had fled. There were concerts. It was a very happening place to be if you were a little kid. For the parents, it wasn't that easy because it was communal living, poverty, food shortages, black markets to try and get eggs and sugar and butter. There are things that my mom, for the rest of her life, wouldn't eat, like margarine. My house never had margarine because those were memories from that time. It was awful. Split pea soup to her was known under a name that was in Latvian. It would translate into something, the horrible green monster for lunch, which meant like a split pea soup. We would never anything to do with peas, split peas, beans. Not in my household ever again. So that time was difficult, and for many of the Latvians there, they were waiting. They were waiting for the aftermath of the war, when the thought was that all of the countries that had won the war they would all go home. The occupation zones of Germany disappeared because the Brits and the English, everybody went home, and they were waiting for the Russians to go home. That never happened. Latvia became a part of the Soviet Union. And for the refugees stuck there in those camps, to them it became a question of what next? Because to live like that in a camp forever is not an option. And the UN started a resettlement program that gave refugees the opportunity to go elsewhere as long as they could find a sponsor who would get them a job. And so the refugees started thinking about where to go. And my grandparents chose America. One of the reasons was that Germany was so devastated, physically devastated, that to them it seemed like if they stay there, they will be staying in a war-like atmosphere for decades to come. So they chose to go to a place that hadn't been physically hit by the war. And for refugees from these camps, it was America, it was Canada, it was Australia, many places that they ended up. But my mom's family, they got sponsored by the Lutheran Church in the US. So they got on their boat to New York. They got off on Ellis Island with refugees, thousands coming from Europe. And then from New York, they moved on to Washington, where there was a job. My grandfather, who had been head of a school, spent the rest of his professional life as a building supervisor and janitor in Washington, because that's the job the sponsor, the Lutheran Church, was able to get for him. And my mom's job was to go to school. So she ended up in high school in Washington. Of course, American high school is in English, no Latvian to be had anywhere. All the German she had started learning, pretty useless in the 1950s in the US. And her job in high school was to do well enough in high school to be able to get a scholarship to college, because there was no other option to go to college for a refugee child that did not have any money. And the US college system is very money-based, not like the European systems. And that's what she did. And I think I can imagine her going through all of that with the one sense of continuity, the one friend she had, Tedis, through all of that, through Germany, through a refugee boat, through a country where she didn't speak the language but had to make it to the top of her class by graduating high school. And so I think if you're going into the unknown, having a constant by your side is incredibly important. And that's what she had, and she made it. She got into university, she got a bachelor's degree. And at that time, there were a lot of other refugees from all sorts of countries in Europe that had ended up in America. And the parents again, and the young people again, very different idea of what's happening. You had a whole generation of parents who were the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the professors, the artists, all of them now in America working jobs in construction, in building management, housekeeping, all of these manual labor jobs. And for them, it was a question of what do you do then with the internal energy that you do have? And what they did is actually pretty amazing. They created the world in which I grew up in. And that was a world where I lived in America, but I lived in Latvia at the same time. Because they created a Latvian society in America. And that was the society that I grew up in. It was a community that had, for me as a child, that had everything. I went to school, normal American school, Monday to Friday. But my evenings and weekends, I lived in a Latvian community. And that meant that good things and bad things. That meant that every Saturday morning I went to school again, because I went to Latvian school. That meant that all of my after-school activities were in the Latvian community. So I learned how to play the kokle, a Latvian instrument that pops up here in these pictures. I was part of a folk dance group. I even played sports. I was on the Washington Latvian volleyball team. I sang in a choir. I did all sorts of things, but basically my entire free time was in the Latvian community. And that community was driven by a sense of the story is not over. We want our country back. And there was that kind of sense permeating this community in Latvia, and it was the same if you went to the Latvian communities in Toronto or in Australia, or even here in not here, but also here in Brussels, but in Germany and Great Britain. Everywhere there were these communities that were keeping themselves together because they thought that it's only a matter of time before Latvia would be independent again. And the longer time went on, generations grew up. And that seemed very far away because it was the Cold War. Even getting to Latvia was a huge undertaking because you couldn't get in. So you lived in this community that lived around an idea. And for some people, that idea was utopian. Many of my age people, young people at that time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they said, whoa, these people are living in some kind of dreamland. You know, I was born in America, this is America, I'm going here. Or, you know, I'm French, I'm German. You know, forget this is way too weird. Parents, grandparents, all of that. But there were other parts of the community that said, this is something so wrong in the world that a country was taken away. And democracy is so important and we're living it and those people that stay behind are not, that this is something worth fighting for. I was in that group. So I spent my youth around issues of regaining Latvian independence. Mind you, in the middle of the Cold War, this wasn't very popular. People looked at you funny. You were always talking to people that said, Latvia, what's that? You point to it on a map and they tell you that's Russia. And you're like, no, it's not. But that was kind of a mission. And if you're a young person, having a cause or a mission or an ideal becomes a very important part of what you're doing and your activities. And for me, it did become a very important part. And living and growing up in this kind of community, when I was about 14, I told my parents two things. I said, I want to be a diplomat, and I want to go to that Latvian school in Germany. Because as all the refugee camps closed in Germany, some things survived. And one thing that survived with the German government's help was the only full-time Latvian language high school in the world outside of Latvia. And I told my parents, I want to go there. And parents, you know, I'm sure some of you can imagine if you told your parents you're 14 and you want to go off to Europe by yourself, or in your case, go off to the United States by yourself, they would raise a few eyebrows and imagine that this idea might fade. But my father said, well, okay, but you know it's very expensive. I'm like, I know. But, you know, we have a few years to save up for it. He's like, you know you have to finish high school here. It's like, I know. I have a plan how to do it earlier. I'm going to go to summer school. I'm going to finish up. And he said, okay, well, you do all that and we'll talk. And I did all that, and he's sitting there, God, she's got to go. And they sent me. So at 16, me and Tedis buckled up, Tedis for courage, came back to Germany with me, and I went to high school for a year in Germany, which was a fabulous experience because it got me, this American citizen with a Latvian heritage, with an idea of Latvia in her mind, it got me squarely into Europe, and I would say broadened my idea of what it is to be not only Latvian but European and all that. So that was a great experience for me, and if you know, being 16 for a year away from your parents is a pretty good thing as well. I would say there was a lot of that as well. But that year ended, and had to go back. So Tedis and I traveled back again to the US, and I went off to college, and I seemed to be feeling strong enough that I left Tedis at home with his original owner, my mom. And Tedis kind of, you know how bears do in the winter, they go into hibernation. So Tedis went into hibernation in a little box packed up with other stuff from childhood. And I'm sure my mom was thinking, well, there will be another generation eventually. Tedis will find a new friend soon. So he lived in his little box. My mom at that time had become, in her professional career, head of the American Latvian Association, which is this organization of Latvians across all of America. I got my degree. I worked for a while at a radio station, Voice of America, which was broadcasting to Latvia. Went back, got another degree, and all during those times, I was very actively participating in political demonstrations, even organizing political demonstrations, not only in the US, but also in Europe. At the time, we would go, for example, to international conferences, such as the ones organized by what was then the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, now the Organization for Security and Confirmation, the OSCE. And we would go to their international conferences with the aim of drawing attention to the plight of Latvia, human rights issues, and independence issues. And we would have demonstrations. Oh, there's one. That was in Vienna. But we would have others whose aim was to get attention, worldwide attention. And one of the biggest ones, or the ones that got the most attention, it wasn't very big, it was actually very small, was a friend of mine who was a Lutheran minister in the US. He had gotten really good at working with the youth in these demonstrations. And my mom at the American Latvian Association called him and said, okay, there's this conference in Madrid. We want to do something. We need attention. Can you figure something out? And he figured something out. He decided he was going to go himself. And he, in front of the conference venue on the opening day, he stood on a flag of the Soviet Union and slit his veins and bled on that flag. Talking all the while about Latvian independence, human rights violations. That was probably the most successful one that was in papers across the globe at that time. But it was kind of the type of things that we were doing to attract attention and kind of keep the dream alive, I would say. So I was doing all those kinds of things in the 80s. And then things started to change in the Soviet Union itself. And the Cold War was looking not so cold anymore. Gorbachev had come to power. Things were loosening up a little, which gave opportunity to many people in Latvia to start talking about these same things we were talking about. And things started happening there. And I had just finished up my master's degree. And I said to my parents again, I said, you know, I'm going to go off to Europe for a bit. Just for a little bit. I need to go to Latvia now. It's so interesting there. I can finally get a visa. I'm not being denied a visa to get there. I'm going to go there for a little while. I had an 8-month plan. I said, and then I'll come back and then I'll get the real job with the real salary and all of that stuff. And you know, at that time, I was old enough, my parents couldn't really say anything. They rolled their eyes and said, if you must. And so I went and I arrived in Latvia at a time when Latvia, a parliament had been elected that had said, we are moving to independence. I went and I started working for these types of politicians that wanted independence for Latvia. And then the difficult part started. We had, there's a picture that'll come up here of January of 1991 in Latvia, where barricades went up in the city because the forces fighting for a renewed independence had gotten so strong that Moscow was trying to fight back against this at the time. And that's what Riga looked like at the time. All of the people came to the streets to protect the parliament, the government buildings, to protect the television, the radio, not to let Soviet forces come in and take over. So these were my first few weeks when I got to Latvia on this 8-month journey. And after participating in that, and then we got to August of 91, there was a coup in Moscow, and at that time Latvia said, we're done, we're out, independence is here. And after that, for me, who had been fighting these issues my entire life, who could leave? And I'd been in Latvia ever since. So I'm back now in Latvia. During this time, because I was in Latvia and my mother was head of the American Latvian Association, we would have great communications. No internet, no mobile telephones, none of this stuff. To call to the Soviet Union meant making a reservation for a few days down the road. So she would, there was constant communication between the American Latvian Association and things going on in Latvia. And I would be wherever I was at that time in Latvia. And radio was the big thing. That's how everybody communicated everything to each other. And I would hear over the radio, Vita Tērauda's mother says, because my mother had called the radio to get information. And they said, by the way, send a message to Vita. They couldn't find me, so they, over the airwaves, they gave me messages. So it was quite an interesting time with having us on both sides of this fight. But I stayed in Latvia, and my mother was still in Washington with the American Latvian Association. And things were now, going well. There's a picture there with 3 little girls. It's my sisters. The littlest one, in 1992, was about to have a baby. And I think Tedis was ready to wake up, come out of hibernation, and get to the next generation for a new friend. But Tedis then had to be brave, very brave himself, because he had rather a tragic adventure of his own. My family's home in Washington burnt down to the ground. I was in Latvia, my parents were on vacation, the house burned down. My grandmother lost her life in that fire. And when we all gathered from everywhere we were in the world, seeing there, you can imagine a burnt down house that has one wall standing and just rubble. But what you never imagine, that in that rubble, some things survive. And Tedis's box that he was hibernating in was only half burnt. And sifting through the rubble, we were pulling things out. And one thing we pulled out was Tedis, surrounded by some half-burnt photo albums and pieces of clothing and things that were in there like memory things. And so half of this box survived this brutal fire, and Tedis survived along with him. He did look a little worse for the wear. That's one of the reasons why when you see him now, he has very little fur. Even now he's been through a partial restoration process. He looked even worse than this before. He lost his bell. He used to have a bell in his ear. The bell melted. So he no longer has a bell. But he survived. But my mother looked at him and, it was clear that he can't really be a permanent friend to a little baby, because he would simply fall apart. So my mom put him away back in the memory box, and we all continued our journeys. My mother stayed with the American Latvian Association her entire professional life. My sister had that baby from '92 and several more after that, who were able to look at Tedis, but my mom didn't hand him out anymore to anybody because he was so fragile. I stayed in Latvia, and I think the bravery and the belief in ideals kept me involved in politics in Latvia. In the '90s, I became a minister in the government, Latvia's first female minister. Then I worked for a long time in the NGO sector, doing all sorts of things. And now, for the last 4 years, I've been in Parliament. One of those pictures has me addressing Parliament, where for the most of those 4 years, I was chairing our European Affairs Committee in Parliament. So you can't get more squarely into Europe than that in Latvia. And Tedis found a new set of adventures for himself. Can you imagine? There's a museum in Latvia. It's like Latvians in the World. It's a small museum that is collecting the stories of the people, of Latvian people outside of Latvia. So a lot of things they were doing, they collect oral histories. And the head of the museum was traveling around the US, talking to people like my mother. And in talking with my mother, she asked, well, what do you have from those times? And my mother showed her Tedis. Her eyes lit up, and Tedis got donated to the museum in Latvia. And the museum in Latvia cooperates here with the museum, and Tedis is on his next adventure now, living in this museum for a while. So Tedis's adventure continues. And it'll be fascinating to see where life and the museum world will take him next, because while he is, as you can see, a little too fragile to be in the hands of children for extended periods of time, I think he'll be able to tell his story for a long time to come. thank you for your attention. I understand I can hand over for question time.
Thank you, Vita, so much. Yes, that was a really, really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And now the time is here for you all to ask your questions, both online and here in the audience as well. If you have a question for Vita, if you have a question about Tedis or his adventures, please raise your hand. Feel free to ask what you like. Don't be shy.
May I hold it for you? Everybody online is looking on it.
When Tedis was brought back into the box and the other children were allowed to see him, the story said that they weren't allowed to keep him, but were they allowed to like hold them for a bit and to feel him or?
When he was in with my mother still, and she was showing him to her grandchildren, my sister's children. Yeah, she would let them touch him, but she didn't want, for example, she didn't want Tedis to be the kind of friend to a child that the child carries around everywhere, because she didn't think Tedis would survive that anymore, because he was so old and fragile and, you know, kind of missing a lot of fur and falling apart at the seams. But they could pick him up and hold him, and she would talk about Tedis. And, you know.
So they couldn't bring him back to their house or
No.
nothing like that?
No, but when they visited Grandma, she would show them Tedis and talk about Tedis's wonderful life, both with my grandmother and with me. I never asked my grandmother why I got Tedis instead of my other two sisters. That remains a mystery.
Do we have any other questions?
Small question. First of all, thank you very much for that wonderful story. It's very interesting. I was just wondering, the rest of your family that is in the United States, did they also come back to Latvia, or?
I'm the only one from my family that lives in Latvia. My parents, when they were still alive, came every year or two to see me, but for them it was definitely vacation. But they would come periodically, especially when I had my own kids. Yeah. Then, of course, if you have grandkids, both in America and Latvia, you have to start splitting your time. But my sisters both still live in the U.S. One of them near Washington, and the other is way off in Colorado. So
We do have a question online. I'd like to ask you, if Tedis could talk, what do you think he would say about his adventures? What would his message be?
Oh, Tedis does talk, of course, to his friends. But I think his message would be, even if you don't know what's coming, to be brave and go forth with bravery and kind of creating your own path and vision. Because I think for him, moving through Europe, through the US, back to Europe, back to the US, back now to Europe, I think him and whoever he was with at the time never really knew what the next step was. But he met those steps with bravery, and I think created a path for himself, even though I think a lot of those situations he was in were not the easiest of situations to be in.
Wonderful, thank you. Do we have any more questions here in the audience? We do have one.
Were you the only person who left the USA, or other people in your family leave?
My family, my sisters, are still in the US, but many of the friends that were my friends in America, my Latvian friends, many of them live in Latvia now. Many of them were just like me, that were so involved with all of the ideas of independence and democracy for Latvia, that when there was an opportunity to help Latvia get back to independence and democracy, they also became very involved and chose to stay and work in Latvia. So I have many friends, many of my youth friends live in Latvia now. I still see them a lot. But just as many people still live in the United States. And for the community, the Latvian community in America had to change as well. As you can imagine, a community organized around the idea of let's get Latvian independence back, and poof, it happens. What happens to the community? And that's a whole other interesting story about what happens to the communities that have to kind of reimagine themselves. What are they about now? And many people, the communities are still alive and well. They're very focused on creating ties to Latvia, either in business or in culture. The one thing that's still going strong is the commitment to teach your children Latvian. And that's one of the things that is a growing thing in the Latvian communities outside of Latvia, are Latvian schools. Those same schools I hated when I was a kid. Because my weekend, I have to go back to school. What's that all about? But those same schools now are popping up all over Europe because so many Latvians are moving to different places in Europe. And the Latvian families are sitting there in Ireland, for example, and saying, wait, if I don't teach my kids Latvian, they're not going to learn Latvian. I don't want that. So they start teaching in family. And then they quickly understand that for somebody to actually learn the language, they have to be able to talk to more people than their parents or grandparents. So they start looking for community, and those communities build up around creating Latvian schools for the kids. And so there's still schools in all sorts of places all around America and Canada and Australia, and there are a growing number of schools all over Europe that do the same, those parents do the same thing to their kids that mine did to me. Mm-hmm. Saturday morning, get up, time for school. So.
We do have another question online from Tony. He asks, what connections do you see between what's happening now with the war in Ukraine, the war in Europe, and maybe some of the experiences that your mother had to go through in Germany? Do you see any connections?
I see a lot of connection with that, a lot of historical parallels, and I would say it's very sad that there are these parallels to things going on today. I think one of the reasons why, for example, my country has the largest per capita support to Ukraine right now in all of Europe, it's because we feel that story. Every family feels what that means. We know exactly what it means when the Russian army comes through, when it stays, when it doesn't leave, what happens to people there. All of the atrocities and human rights abuses we're seeing in Ukraine, they all happened 50 years ago. More than 50 years now. But they all happened in World War II and in the aftermath of World War II in that part of the world. And I think there's a lot of empathy for the Ukrainians right now. So there is a lot of support both for the Ukrainians militarily, and there is very much open arms for the Ukrainian refugees. Because every family in Latvia understands what it means when you have to pick up and leave, and you're leaving because your town is being bombed or your home no longer exists. Or as now, we're now expecting a new wave of refugees from Ukraine because as Russia destroys civilian infrastructure, the electricity, the heating systems, it's clear that many more people will find it difficult to survive the winter. And they will come, even if they have to come temporarily to other places in Europe. They will come, and we're expecting more. And I think you can see that all across the eastern part of Europe, where you have families whose family history contains this experience. They're very much welcoming open arms to the Ukrainians today because we feel for their situation, and I think it impacts very much how Europe as a whole is reacting to the situation in Ukraine. And for me, I hope that it means that we will continue the support until this is over in a way that Ukraine regains its peace and territorial integrity that enables everyone to stay in Ukraine or to return to Ukraine. Because for refugees, it's a different type of migration. They're not looking to build a new life elsewhere. They have left because of war and they want to go home if they can achieve peace.
Thank you. We we still have some time. Is there anybody else?
May I ask a question myself? Hello, I'm working here at the museum as well, so sorry to thank you all. Thank you for being here and thank you for sharing your story as well. You talked about you living in a utopian kind of pseudo-Latvian world in the US already, but then you came to the real Latvia. Can you tell us a bit more about your experiences when you came to the real Latvia and what was different that you expected, or was it exactly the same as you expected? And how people were like welcoming you in your home country?
I think when I came to Latvia, for me, I came in December of 1990. So even though Latvia had elected political leaders that wanted independence, I was very much aware that I was coming to the Soviet Union. I needed a visa, a Soviet visa to get in, etc. So for me, the mentality was I'm going into the Soviet Union and I'm going to be working on Latvian independence issues. Having the mentality that you're going to the Soviet Union turned out to be a good thing because I didn't expect anything. I expected to be in the Soviet Union. I expected food shortages. I expected a lot of discomfort. I knew that was coming. It didn't faze me, all of that. People who came a few years later that came to an independent Latvia, they were expecting Europe. Maybe a little poorer, but Europe. And what they got was the Soviet Union, maybe a little freer in the way things felt still, because it takes a long time to recreate a democracy in a country. So having said that, I think I had no expectations about the uncomfortable side of life. So it made it easier for me, really. The attitudes of Latvians in Latvia towards the Latvians in the West, it's been a roller coaster over these years. When we first came in 1990, it was everybody was euphoric. It was very much kind of a, you know, the Latvian nation is coming together again. We are tearing down the walls, the barriers, getting to know each other again. The people from the West have everything. They speak Western languages. They appear to have money, even though we didn't. I mean, I was a student, no money, but still, you know, it appears that, you know, the saviors have come. You know, very quickly they found out that the people are motivated by different things, and the community is very diverse. So there was a little kind of souring of attitudes where they say, oh, all these people want is some kind of, they're here for personal gain, they're not interested in anything else. There was that kind of dip. And then slowly it came back up again to where we are today, where, as is normal, people look at you as a person and then decide who you are, instead of look at you as a category or a representation of something. So it's been, the attitudes have been up and down, but I think for most people that have relocated basically from outside of Latvia back to Latvia, as long as they stick around and are engaged in recognizable things, such as, you know, normal jobs, there's no, I mean, I don't feel any difference in the way people treat me or the way they would treat somebody who has born and grown up in Latvia. But this is, you know, 30 years later. I've lived longer in Latvia than I've lived anywhere else in my life now, by now. So it's been a long journey. But the attitudes been up and down over the 3 decades I've been there. So.
Just 1 second.
When you went to Latvia, was it easy to find a place to live and stay?
No, it wasn't. When I went in 1990, when I went to Latvia, I was very concerned about where I was going to live, because I didn't have many relatives in Latvia, and the relatives I did have were not in the capital city. But I had arranged like an internship type of job. And at that time, these independence-minded politicians would travel to Washington and other places, and I'd met with them in Washington, helped them set up their meetings with American politicians. And I told them, it's like, I'd like to come to Latvia. You know, I'm going to finish up my master's degree, this is it. And they all said, yes, when you get there, let me know, we'll set you up with something. And I'm sitting there, I was like, no, I need something, I need to know, I need something arranged now. And there was only one politician who understood that I couldn't just arrive and wander around and look for a job. And he said, okay, you come, get here by this date, you come work for me. And that was working in that time, Council of Ministers, so like the government, prime minister's type of office. You're going to work on building business ties with the United States. This is what you're going to do. And I said, okay, where am I going to live? He says, you need a place to live. I said, yeah, I don't have relatives in Riga. He's like, okay, that's no problem. By the time you get here, we'll get you, you know, a official apartment, because in the Soviet Union, apartments were allocated. There was you couldn't just go rent one. It didn't happen like that. And so I got there, and he handed me a letter, and the letter said, you know, there was an address, and it was like a letter of instruction to a building supervisor at that address to allocate this apartment to me. And I look at the letter, and the letter is signed by the prime minister of the country. That is how scarce apartments were in the Soviet era. And I'm looking at this letter, and I'm looking at my employer, and I say, really, the prime minister? And he looks at me, he's like, some of it is still Soviet, but I have pull. I'm like, okay. And that's how I got my first apartment there. And I lived there for a while, until me not being comfortable with the Soviet era arrangements. As soon as I was able to, as soon as like a housing market opened up, then I was able to purchase a little apartment of my own. And then I kind of moved out of that system and into what would be seen as a normal housing market anywhere in Europe. But the first steps were really hard, because I had no idea, and I was very nervous about it, going to Latvia.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
What languages does Tedis speak? And also, when you came back to Latvia, how did you feel a difference between your Latvian and the Latvian?
Okay, well, Tedis's native language is, of course, Latvian, because that's what he spoke with my mother and with me. But I would imagine Tedis, along the way, picked up German, definitely, English, most definitely. I'm not quite sure he picked up any Russian, because he wasn't with me when I was learning Russian. So that may have escaped him. But he was with me when I was still in high school in the US, where I also studied French. So he may have what I would call adequate tourist French. But I would say Latvian, English, and German most definitely. Yes. And my Latvian versus Latvian in Latvia, it is a little different, or was a little different at the time. Because I was so involved in the Latvian communities in the US and in Germany. Once I had gone to Latvian high school in Germany, I was a pretty hardcore person. I came back to the United States, I got my bachelor's degree, and when all of my friends went off for their junior year abroad, I had two opportunities. I could go back to Germany for a junior year abroad, or I could go to Kalamazoo, Michigan, where they were setting up a Latvian language program at Western Michigan University. Fool that I was, I went to Michigan. And I spent a year in Kalamazoo at college in a Latvian language program. which was actually very good, because then also uniquely, even for anybody in the US, my first serious full-time job after college required me to speak Latvian all day, every day, because it was at the Latvian service of the Voice of America. So my Latvian coming to Latvia was way better than most would expect. But I still had an American accent. I still have an American accent, much less in Latvian. And now I have something else. My English no longer sounds American native. It sounds, when I am in America, they ask me where I'm from. In Europe, it's still definitely identifiable as American, but in America, no longer. So I'm now pleasantly accented in every single language I speak. But that's life.
And I'm sure Tedis is too.
I'm sure, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we have to come to a close. But thank you, Vita, so much for sharing both your story and your family's story, and Tedis as well. We're so honored that you could be here with us today. I would also like to extend a warm thank you to our technical crew. I encourage everybody in our audience to go and see Tedis in person here at the House of European History. You can see him on the 3rd floor. We're open 7 days a week. You can visit our website or follow us on social media to discover future events. Thank you for joining us today as we looked through the lens of hidden treasures. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.